Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Autism 204, which is titled Naturalistic Developmental Behavioral Interventions for Autism Spectrum Disorder. I am Mendy Minharas, and I'm going to introduce myself, give you a little bit of background on who I am, and then we're going to jump right into tonight's topic. I do want to just a couple quick housekeeping things. I know we're being broadcast live on Facebook, and we will be using the chat function or the comment function tonight to take questions. So somebody is receiving those questions, and when we get to the end of the presentation, we'll be leaving about 15 minutes or so to read some of those questions out and answer them. And if we don't have time to get to any, or if there's any that we want to go more in depth on, we'll look at other ways of communicating back, for example, through a written answer on Facebook in the comments. So feel free to be entering your questions as you think of them. So I'm really excited for tonight's talk. It's not on COVID, which is hopefully a nice relief for a lot of you guys. It's certainly a nice relief for me because I feel like I've spent a lot of time recently dealing with this crisis since I work in healthcare. But tonight we're going to talk about how to do behavioral intervention for kids with autism spectrum disorder in a more naturalistic and developmentally appropriate and therefore fun fashion. So hopefully it'll be an energizing topic, and maybe it'll give folks some ideas about things you can be doing if you're the parent of a child with autism, for example, things you can be doing with your child at home during this time when we're all stuck in our homes, and otherwise, hopefully, it's applicable information for those of you who are listening. So I am a clinical psychologist. I have background in behavior analysis, applied behavior analysis, as well as in assessment and diagnosis of autism. I've worked in the field for over 20 years doing those various clinical activities. And currently, I'm the interim executive director of the Seattle Children's Autism Center. And I'm also a faculty member at the University of Washington in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. And the majority of my research and clinical work has focused on this more kind of naturalistic, implementation of applied behavior analysis, and also on parent training, how to train parents in these interventions. So I'm pretty excited to be getting into some of this information with you guys tonight. So a couple quick disclosures. Hoffman LaRoche is a pharmaceutical company that I've done a little bit of consulting with to help them understand more about autism. And Brooks Publishing did publish a book this year that I'm an author on the topic we're going to be talking about tonight. So I do like to disclose that because I will be talking some about the book and some of its content, and I am an author on that publication. So just to be clear about those relationships. So we are going to talk initially about just some, quick basics. A lot of times when we're live on a platform like Facebook, there's really wide variety of folks who are listening. So some of the basics, like, some basic information about autism and kind of basics of how we intervene to target skills with kids with autism may be new to some of you guys. But then we're really going to get into, a deeper dive on this framework of naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention. So we'll first kind of go over an overview, then we'll go a little deeper into implementation of this type of ABA intervention, and then we'll actually talk about some more specific teaching examples and some other resources, related to this topic. So let's jump in. For those of you who may not be as familiar with the diagnostic criteria for autism, just a quick, brief overview. For those of you who are familiar, it's kind of a reminder of, what kinds of skills and what kinds of areas we need to target in autism intervention. So as most of you probably know, in 2013, we moved from DSM-IV to DSM-V. And so now the diagnostic criteria for autism have to do with difficulties or deficits in the area of social communication, as well as restricted and repetitive behaviors, unusual interests, that kind of thing. And really, primarily what we're going to be talking about tonight is the social communication side of things. How do we foster social communication skills, especially in young children? So that'll be our focus tonight. Little bit of prevalence information. It's ever evolving and changing, as I'm sure you all know, but the current statistics are 1 in 59 children, or close to 2% of children in the United States, are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. The ratio of males to females is 4 to 1. So it's, it's a higher percentage in boys, 1 in 39 boys versus 1 in 152 girls. And, being true to the name autism spectrum disorder, the way that autism can manifest and the intellectual disabilities associated with that can be pretty broad. It's truly across a spectrum. So about a third of individuals diagnosed with autism will have intellectual disability. A quarter or so will be sort of in the borderline range, meaning that, those individuals are functioning okay, but don't have IQ or intellectual disability in the average range. And, somewhere between 40 and 50% function in the average to the above average range. So that's really a lot of variability in how folks with autism function and what kind of interventions they may or may not need. So let's talk a little bit more about intervention. Although autism is a disorder characterized, primarily by social communication deficits and unusual behavior patterns, there's often a lot of kind of trickle-down effect, or sometimes we talk about it as a cascading effect on other areas of development. So when a child has deficits in social communication, a lot of the behaviors that they're not engaging in, for example, imitating others or paying attention to the social cue or the language and gestures of others, those behaviors interfere with learning across the board. If you don't imitate someone else, for example, then there are many behaviors, even behaviors that have nothing to do with autism, like motor skills, that you may not learn, because children learn so many behaviors from, via kind of social communication modalities. So although social communication is at the core of what we might want to target in autism, really we're typically looking at all possible developmental domains so that we can really understand what that cascading effect on development might be, and how we then need to intervene across potentially a broad range of developmental areas. So the areas listed here, fairly well capture the domains we might want to work in. And of course, every individual would need an individualized intervention program to target, their specific areas of need. And it may be all of these, or it may just be 1 or 2, but the treatment program would be individualized in that way. I like to go back to this quote, which is now almost 20 years old. It's hard for me to imagine that this much time has gone by. But I find this quote to be very helpful. Because, over the years, those of you who've been in the field for a long time will know, over the years, there has been intense debate about how many hours of intervention, kids need, how many hours are effective and empirically supported. And I find this particular quote from the National Research Council book, which came out in 2001, to be really useful, because what it talks about is intensity of intervention, which, generally there's a belief that that high intensity intervention is needed when the developmental delays are pervasive, but that intensity can be thought of as, providing a child with large numbers of functional and developmentally relevant and high interest or highly motivating opportunities to engage in active responding. And that doesn't necessarily equate to, quote, therapy all the time, or it doesn't necessarily equate to something that looks like therapy all the time. It can equate to something that appears much more play-like and much more naturalistic, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight. But if the child is receiving those opportunities to engage in functional skills that are developmentally relevant and highly motivating, then those interactions may potentially be as or even more therapeutic sometimes than something that appears to be more therapeutic. So I find that to just be a really, a quote that continues to be relevant over time. And of course, we always talk about earlier is better. And this is, well documented in the literature at this point, that the earlier we intervene on social communication in particular, the better in terms of long-term outcomes. And, a lot of the current thinking is that besides the plasticity and development and the plasticity in the brain during that time, also that the sooner you intervene, the more you avoid that cascading effect that I talked about, where that the social communication deficits compound themselves by leading to further delay as a result of lack of learning. So the earlier we can intervene on that and try to get it back on the right course, the more the child's learning opportunities are going to open up. So quick little rundown on ABA. So, in the field of autism, ABA, or applied behavior analysis, is considered the gold standard treatment. Many of you probably know that ABA therapy in Washington is covered by Medicaid. This has been the case for a number of years now. It wasn't always, and so that's why it's relevant to mention that. Many other insurance plans do cover it, but not all. To access Medicaid or to access ABA, there has to be, orders or kind of a statement of medical necessity. But, in the field and in the literature, ABA is considered medically necessary in the treatment of autism. But what we're going to be talking about tonight is there are different types of ABA or different ways that ABA can be implemented. And so historically, and we'll kind of do some comparing and contrasting so this makes a bit more sense, but historically, the earliest forms of ABA were what's known as discrete trial teaching. So teaching that was highly structured, that was adult-driven, that was fairly repetitive, even drill-like in some cases. And although, this type of intervention was shown to result in skills acquisition, in, kids gaining skills, it had some drawbacks that, it wasn't always as motivating as it could be, and it wasn't always as developmentally friendly and so on. And so there's been a lot of evolution in the field such that we, are now at this place where we have this other, sort of category that we're, now kind of terming naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions. And these are ABA-based interventions that are sort of evolved from this early form of teaching. And discrete trial teaching is absolutely a very relevant tool now, in the here and now. But it sort of used to be the only tool in the toolbox, and now I would say it's one of a collection of tools in the toolbox. And we're going to be talking more tonight about the more naturalistic way of doing ABA, but we will compare it a little bit to discrete trial teaching. So there are a number of models that would fall under the naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention category. A few of them are listed here, and we're actually going to talk more about those in the coming slides. So a little more on ABA. So we have our foundation here. I definitely want to make sure that, we're clear on the fact that this idea of naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention is grounded in applied behavior analysis. These are interventions that are grounded in the science of ABA, and they use ABA teaching methodology. It's the nuances of how these interventions are different is in the delivery or the implementation. So, there's a lot of confusion, I think, oftentimes about what ABA is, and, people sort of equate it with being treatment for autism, as opposed to understanding that actually all ABA is the science of behavior change or the science of learning. We all alter our behavior based on things like an outcome of a certain behavior. If you have a negative experience somewhere, you are going to alter your behavior next time. That's learning. And it applies to all of us in every context we're in, every moment that we're awake. And what ABA has done over the years is to identify and define all those principles that govern learning, described them, studied them, and then, really looked at how we can use those principles intentionally to increase skills or decrease unwanted behaviors. And this kind of methodology is used in, the treatment of many disorders, not just limited to autism spectrum disorder. Behavioral principles are used in anxiety treatments, in depression treatments, in smoking cessation, in, obesity and weight loss programs. There's many, many different ways that ABA gets used. So what occurred, in the 70s and in the 80s was people really came to realize that this methodology seemed to work very well for children with autism. And so once that started to kind of catch on, the field of ABA really exploded in this particular area. But it wasn't born in the world of autism per se, and it's not limited to the world of autism. So I think that is sometimes confusing for people. So, so in ABA, besides that it's the science of behavior change and kind of a clear delineation of the principles that govern learning, ABA also uses scientific methods themselves to demonstrate that what's being done in treatment is working. So ABA is not a treatment where we, a clinician would say, yeah, I think the child seems to be getting better. That seems to be going well. What you would expect to hear from an ABA therapist is the data show me, or the graphs demonstrate, because we oftentimes collect data on actual numbers of behaviors, for example, and graph them. The graphs demonstrate that the behavior is changing or that the child is improving. So we in ABA, we call it database decision making. We use the information that we can gather from observing the child's progress to make decisions about what we're going to do next. We don't ever do that based on our impression. So these are some of the real foundational principles of ABA. So in ABA, the reason I have this slide and the next couple slides on here is because this particular sequence is totally key to teaching skills in ABA. And how it gets used is key to understanding the difference between discrete trial interventions and more naturalistic interventions. So in ABA, we talk all the time about the ABC, or the three-term contingency. And essentially the idea with this contingency is that every behavior, so since we're talking about teaching skills to kids in this particular presentation, every behavior or skill that we might be trying to teach a child is preceded by something, the antecedent, which is, the event that lets the child know they should engage in a behavior, cues the child for the behavior, prompts the child. And every behavior is followed by a consequence. And the consequence, may or may not seem directly related to the behavior in the moment. But the reality is if those two things, if one leads to the other, then that consequence is going to have an impact on the behavior. And so, for example, when we're teaching a skill, what we know is that we can put a child in a situation, let's say it's as simple as, holding back the toy that the child wanted, and letting them know that they need to communicate for it. That would be our antecedent. Any communication behavior the child gives would be the behavior. And then we would want to provide a positive consequence so the child understands, yes, that was the behavior we were trying to teach, by giving the child the object, let's say, that they had just requested. And so the consequence is then tied to the behavior, which creates learning. So when we're trying to teach skills, we are constantly trying to create this situation where we're creating cues on purpose to try to increase behaviors that aren't already happening routinely. And so in this case, the antecedent would be any instruction or an opportunity that we would create, a situation. For example, maybe just waiting for a child to respond might be like a situation we would create, to let the child know that a behavior should take place. The behavior would be, teaching the child the correct skill. And sometimes we have to do a lot of prompting and teaching so that they understand what behavior they're supposed to use. And then the consequence would be providing reinforcement to the child so that they understand, yes, that was the behavior we were looking for, and we're going to increase the likelihood, that they're going to do that again by having provided that consequence to them. So anytime we're teaching, this is always the sequence we use, no matter how we execute it. And so when we talk about embedded teaching, which is something I'm going to be, talking about throughout this presentation, what we mean is that we're taking this sequence and we're embedding it into activities with the child. And I'll give lots of examples of that throughout the presentation. So here's one simple example. Parent and child are in front of a closed door, and the parent says to the child, "Open." The child says "open" if maybe they're working on single word requests or that type of communication. And as a consequence, to let the child know that was the correct response, the parent opens the door. So the positive consequence increases the likelihood that the child is going to say "open" the next time they're at the door, right? And learn. So learning has occurred. So this is what we're trying, this is the loop that we're trying to create in ABA. So we oftentimes call this a teaching trial or a teaching loop. And those are terms you'll hear me use throughout. So to kind of compare and contrast a little bit, so again, and I'm not going to spend too much time on discrete trial. For folks that aren't familiar with that methodology, this will just be a very basic, sort of quick compare and contrast. For those of you who are familiar, you'll, quickly see the difference if you don't already know the difference. So in discrete trial teaching, the adult really controls the interaction much more than the child. So the pacing and the materials and the activities are much more chosen and controlled by the adult. It's teaching that often occurs in more kind of controlled sessions where maybe the setting is arranged to kind of minimize distractions. And oftentimes the reinforcer, what we give to the child as a consequence for the behavior, is unrelated to the teaching stimuli. So I'll give you guys some examples of this. Whereas naturalistic intervention is in a context that's much more learner initiated. So the child might show interest in something and then the adult would follow and then use that as a teaching context. So the stimuli are very learner selected. And then gaining access to those items is the reinforcement. So the reinforcement is directly tied to what's being taught in that context. So let's look at some examples. So let's say we were going to try to teach a child names of family members, who's grandpa versus grandma versus mom versus dad, or who's Susie versus Bobby or whoever. So we could use flashcards or photographs, right? And we could sit and go through those, like, who's this? That's grandpa. Good, that's grandpa. Okay, here's a toy you can play with for a minute, that kind of thing. And that's effective. The child would learn that. But we could also do it, for example, during a game with those people. So let's say we had grandma and grandpa, mom and dad around the room, and the cue was, find mommy. And when the child runs to mommy, then mommy gives tickles and, or picks the child up or gives attention, that kind of thing. So each one of those contains a trial. There is a cue for the child to engage in a behavior. There is the correct identifying of the person, and there's some kind of reinforcement, but they look really different in their execution, right? Same thing with teaching colors. We might use shapes that are different colors, and we might go through like what color, or even again flashcards or blocks, and then reinforce the correct color with, again, access to a preferred toy or access to a little treat. But we could do the very same type of thing within an activity. So using a puzzle with different color pieces and then reinforcing by giving the child the puzzle piece to put in the puzzle, or blocks or Legos or markers, like you get the idea. Teaching imitation, we do a lot of teaching imitation using discrete trials in ABA. And this is one I would say, like in our program at Seattle Children's, we oftentimes go back to discrete trials because it's hard to teach. But, so it's where you kind of pull out the tool you need when you need it. But so we can do imitation in a rote way, like just, do this or copy me. But we can also, again, do it embedded in play. So like, oh, do this and drive a car. And then when the child imitates, they get access to the car to do what they want to do with it, that kind of thing. So you start to kind of see the, the difference between the two, and how one is more play-based, is more naturalistic, is a little more free-flowing, that kind of thing. But also oftentimes, more developmentally appropriate, especially for young kids, and more motivating. So getting a little more into the details of our naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions. So the American Academy of Pediatrics released these guidelines in 2015. And I like to highlight them just because, the AAP is such a broad organization. And so, when you think about the impact of guidelines from an organization that's that broad, it's pretty widespread. And so I think it's really important for us as a field, in the field of autism treatment, to be disseminating information about how to do the guideline there that is highlighted in red, which is what we're talking about tonight. So the combination of developmental and behavioral approaches, and not necessarily limiting our intervention to a solely behavior analytic approach. So then around the same time, this paper came out. And what was really significant about this paper, if you're interested in research, or if you are a researcher or a clinician, this is well worth looking up. The folks that are authors on this paper are all researchers and clinicians who have developed their own treatment model that would fall under this umbrella of naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions. And you'll see these names come up throughout the presentation. And what was really significant about this paper was these folks all came together, and they each have a stake or a vested interest in promoting their own model, certainly, but they all also, realized over time that the models were born out of the same sets of principles, the same scientific field, and shared a lot of common features. And so rather than, making it confusing by having people have to compare and contrast early start Denver versus pivotal response treatment versus incidental teaching, they all came together and said, why don't we pull out the common elements across all of our models and articulate that, so that people can start to make more sense of all these terms that you hear in the field and all these different models and so on. So that's what this paper did. And that the paper then was a springboard for the book. See, I told you we were going to talk about the book. Was a springboard for the book that was then released in kind of mid to late 2019, where we took the principles that were outlined in the paper and really fully developed that out into a set of content about how to do naturalistic behavioral intervention. So this book was not meant to replace all those models. It's really meant to enhance and kind of augment those models and assist with dissemination. Because some of the models are associated with formal trainings that are expensive or, kind of are written in such a way that they're not always very parent friendly, that kind of thing. And so we just wanted to kind of boil it down to, these are the common elements. These are the principles of how you teach. You can teach it from, early start Denver model. You can teach it from PRT. You can teach it from here, but now you kind of understand how it all fits together was the purpose of the book. And then we also had a conference last fall, and the reason I bring this up is just because I think it really represents an evolution in the field. Again, all the authors who have developed these models came together for a day-long conference where they presented on their model, but also how it relates to this broader field of naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention. So I think it was a really nice step toward, kind of breaking down silos and bringing people together and clarifying, for the field, the ways in which these models are similar and different. So let's get into a little bit more detail. So in NDBI, or Naturalistic Developmental Behavioral Intervention, big mouthful, I've been very clear so far that we really draw from the field of applied behavior analysis. This is absolutely grounded in ABA. But these types of interventions also draw from developmental science. There is a whole field of developmental science that provides us with a great deal of information about how children learn, how children develop, what trajectories in development are like, which skills are precursors for other skills, why that is, so on and so forth. And so, there's a rich body of work that has been done in developmental science, some of which, was certainly pulled into ABA prior to this, but I would say not emphasized in the same way. And so this is really more of a merging of the two fields. And so this is where we get NDBI as kind of a newer construct. So these are the 6 models that I will highlight tonight: Project Impact, Pivotal Response Treatment, JASPER, Early Start Denver Model, Enhanced Milieu Teaching, and Incidental Teaching. We are not going to go into the nuances of, what's unique about each one versus what overlaps about each one. I think the thing to know about these models is I would say they are the most kind of known or prominent models, but most importantly, they are the models with strong empirical support. So there are certainly other models out there in the field that are either being developed or maybe are earlier in development and don't have as much empirical support. And in the book and in this presentation, I really kind of stick to the models that have more solid empirical support. But all of these models fall under this umbrella. They all use similar sets of principles. And a lot of the differences between them are nuances. Maybe one model slightly emphasizes one thing more than another, that kind of thing. Again, just to sort of look at it a different way, this also, is a slide that shows which researchers are associated with which models, kind of who the founders of the model were. The ones with the asterisks next to them do have one or more randomized controlled trials to support their effectiveness. But again, they all are backed by a pretty strong body of empirical support. So there are common elements across all NDBI, and this is what we're going to now kind of get into, is regardless of which model we're talking about, just what are the common elements? Why lump all these things together? Well, it's because they have a lot of common elements. One of the first things to think about is the common elements in terms of learning targets. Again, we talked at the beginning how learning can and should occur across all developmental domains if it needs to. These kinds of models really program for generalization from the beginning. So, generalization being the idea that what's taught in therapy has to be able to be transferred to the child's, functioning in the real world, or it's not a useful skill. And because these models oftentimes teach in the real world or in the natural context, generalization, isn't really as much of a question because the child is learning how to use the skill in the context where they should use it. And oftentimes skills are taught in a little less isolation. So, we might be like fluidly working on multiple skills at one time, which has its pros and cons depending on the child. But a lot of times if you can, if the child can stay with that kind of learning, you can really be targeting multiple things at the same time and getting a lot of benefit from how you're working. The learning context, I would say, is also one of the most important things and one of the biggest differences from previous forms of ABA. Like I mentioned, the trials are what we call embedded. So as opposed to like sitting down and running flashcards or drills with the child, the trials are embedded in the natural interactions, and we'll see some videos of this later on. But the idea is for those interactions to be emotionally meaningful with adults that the child is connected to and has a relationship with, that those trials are occurring in the natural context, within natural routines, that kind of thing. And then the last area is that in addition to all the ABA strategies being used, that development enhancing strategies that come out of developmental science are also embedded. So in addition to the prompting and the reinforcement, also adding in strategies like imitating the child, for example, which has been shown to increase children's, attention to the adult and their interest and their motivation, how adults are using their affect, what kinds of things they're modeling for the child, that kind of thing. So we'll go into more detail on those. Common procedural elements, these are sort of more technical elements. So all the interventions that we're talking about tonight are manualized in some way. I have a slide at the very end of this talk that has information about the interventions that are manualized and publicly available. They're not all publicly available. Each one of these interventions has some way of coding or scoring or monitoring treatment fidelity, which is just a fancy way of saying, like, are you doing the treatment the way it's supposed to be done? And of course, this is important. If we want to ensure that kids are getting high quality treatment, we want to be taking data not just on the child's performance, but also on the clinician or the adult's performance in terms of how they're implementing treatment. And then all of these interventions, again, are, use ongoing measurement, data collection, data-driven decision-making, like we talked about previously. So to get a little bit more into detail on instructional strategies, excuse me, I have to keep myself hydrated here as I'm talking. So this is a list of instructional strategies that have been kind of pulled out, again, across all the models. And the green ones are the ones that are sort of more behavioral or in nature. And the blue ones are the ones that are a little bit more developmental in nature. And there's definitely overlap, and there's, again, a lot of nuances, but more or less, I think this is a fair way to divide some of these strategies. So, and we're going to go into more detail on all of these, but again, you see how we have that three-part contingency, we have prompting, we have reinforcement, but we also have strategies like child-initiated teaching episodes and balanced turns within teaching so that we're creating reciprocity and instead of having it be so adult-driven, and, so on and so forth. So to go, down into the weeds a little bit more then on what this actually looks like. one of the things I always like to touch on is motivation. Motivation as a, construct in and of itself. Certainly we're interested in motivation anytime we're teaching any child or anyone for that matter, anything. But I think motivation is really, really key for children with ASD when we're teaching, because the core social communication deficits that are inherent in autism have a significant impact on motivation. Anybody who knows an individual with ASD knows you may or may not be able to get them at any given moment in time to be motivated in the same way that you are in a given context, right? All kids are like this to a certain extent, of course, but kids who are not seeing the perspective of another person are oftentimes really marching to the beat of their own drummer and may just really not be motivated to get on the same page as you with what needs to be taught or what context we're going to teach in and so on. So since we can't rely on that social motivation that typically developing children have, we really need to be taking stock of the child with autism's motivation in treatment. So, I mean, I always say, I don't know that there's research published on this per se or how other people talk about it, but clinically, based on my clinical experience, I always say, I think motivation is equally as important as targeting skills in any given interaction with a child. So, oftentimes it can be tempting, for example, to push a child a little harder and maybe work on, get one more trial in or work on something a little harder. But if you do that at the expense of motivation and you lose your whole teaching context, then that cost might have actually been quite high. And so, I really view that as 50-50, even if you're maybe not doing any trials at all for a period of time, but you've got the child motivated and engaged. Like, first of all, learning is occurring in that context, even if teaching trials are not happening. But also, I like to think of it as like you're filling the gas tank during that time. You are getting yourself that social motivation bank built up that you need so that you can embed some teaching trials, in that context. So, motivation leads to engagement, and engagement gives you a context for teaching. And of course, then targeting skills leads to progress, but it all needs to fit together in a cohesive picture, and one can't be at the expense of the other. So this is a table actually from the book, and this is just, clinical experience essentially. Some of these behaviors are behaviors that are talked about in the literature and that people look at, in terms of being sort of corollaries of motivation. But clinically, they're meaningful ways to sort of think about, like, hey, is this kid engaged with me right now? So responsivity is just literally like, how often is the child answering you or responding in a way that shows that they were with you, as opposed to doing their own thing, ignoring you, that kind of thing. Reciprocity. So, how often is the child responding in a synchronous way, meaning like in a way that relates to what you just did, as opposed to in a way that is, sort of more related to the child's own agenda. Response latency. So just how quickly does the child respond? Child affect, certainly very hard to measure in a reliable way, but also child affect is one of those things that if you know the child, you kind of know, right? So it might be happiness, it might be smiling, it might be laughing, it might be energy. It also might be like intense interest or engagement, remaining in proximity, those kinds of things. And certainly challenging behavior relates. The presence of challenging behavior suggests that we're probably not in a motivating context right now. Social orienting, so literally body orientation, eye contact, those kinds of things. Joint attention, so is the child, alternating eye gaze with, me as the therapist or with the adult, to share enjoyment or showing objects, giving objects, that kind of thing. Imitation, certainly, if a child is imitating you, you definitely know they're paying attention. It can be actions, it can be words. And initiation, I think this is one of the biggest telltale signs and one of the, the highest level sort of outcomes we're looking for. Does the child initiate with you? So as opposed to just, that they respond when you initiate, are they actually showing the motivation and the initiative to be the one who starts that? That's a really significant indicator. So in NDBI, we've talked already kind of about, how skills are broken down in ABA. They're still taught systematically in NDBI. But again, the teaching is embedded in natural activities. The reinforcement is directly related to the task. And then, intervention is play-based. It's occurring within daily routines in the natural environment, and it's more child-driven. So when we talk about embedding teaching trials, this is really hinges on what the role of the adult or the communication partner is in the natural environment. And again, we talk a lot about how to set up those trials or contrive those teaching opportunities, even though it might be within play or within a natural activity. We're kind of inserting something into it that maybe wouldn't have been there otherwise, because we're trying to create more opportunities for responding. And then by doing that, we can incorporate these behavioral teaching principles across all sorts of settings, daily routines, et cetera. So the goal becomes to, create opportunities for learning during any, possible context where you can. And again, an opportunity can be, sometimes it's a question, sometimes it's an offer, sometimes it's an instruction, sometimes it's just a contrived circumstance that the adult creates to provide the child with an opportunity to respond. So an example of a circumstance, I gave the one example about going through the door. Another example might be like when we're trying to teach kids to gain attention from adults appropriately. We oftentimes might be sitting and playing, and then we might, kind of have some of the materials that the child needs next and turn our back and like pretend to be busy. We're sort of like, you have to be a good actor if you're going to be an ABA therapist or NDBI therapist. Oh, I'm really busy. I can't pay attention to you right now. And, you're doing it on purpose so that the child might have to tap you or say your name or say, hey, I need some more, or get your attention somehow. And then you can reinforce them by giving attention and giving access to objects. So our goal is to provide as many of these behaviorally based opportunities throughout these natural interactions, activities, routines, et cetera. And that, we can, again, use these strategies to teach any skill, and that we're embedding those developmental strategies as well. So this is really, really important, this particular slide. We've already seen our antecedent behavior consequence sequence. We have a little familiarity with that. But if we are going to have a reinforcer, a positive consequence to provide the child once they engage in the skill, we have to have some control over the learning materials, right? The child can't just have everything they want already, dumped out on the floor or whatever it may be, because then we have no leverage to try to evoke a skill from the child. And so shared control, and we'll talk a lot more about shared control in the coming slides, shared control becomes the way that we do that. And the reason it's called shared control is because it's about putting yourself in a context with a child and activities that they've shown interest in. So maybe they went over and grabbed the box of trains, and so that's their part of the control. They got to choose the activity. The adult's part of the control is how we manage those materials. Like, oh, okay, let's play trains. Open the box, maybe give the child 4 or 5 pieces, maintain some control over it so that they have to continue to interact with you to get more, as one example. So there, in shared control, there has to be this balanced way of managing the materials, because if the child can just access what they want, they're probably going to do that. And they're not necessarily going to be as motivated to communicate. Shared control is also about social reciprocity and balancing turns within the interaction. So, a really natural way to create shared control, for example, is like your turn, my turn. Because then when it's my turn, I have the control, and I'm not going to give it back to you until you've communicated with me. So it's not just about like hoarding everything that the child wants and doling it out only if they, communicate with you. It's about creating this balance and this flow that allows you to have some control and get those responses, but in a way that feels natural. So in shared control, again, we're always using child-selected, highly preferred activities. So, sometimes this is toys, it can be snacks, it can be gross motor activities, it can be songs, it can be anything the child's showing interest in. Sometimes it's self-stimulatory behavior. But the way what activity to use is by looking at what they're showing interest in. And so we call that following the child's lead. So sometimes it's seeing what materials they take out. Sometimes it's watching what they're looking at. Sometimes it's just seeing what they're doing, but you have to be paying attention to the child's cues to try to sort of gauge their motivation in that moment. And once the child shows interest in something, you can either wait for them to initiate. So that would be like an incidental teaching strategy or incidental teaching way of doing it. Wait for them to initiate, and then maybe prompt them to use a slightly more difficult communication behavior or a communication behavior that they're working on. But you can also give the child a cue or a prompt that if they make a response to you, you're going to give them access as well. So there's different ways that you can start to create learning trials within that moment where you're following the child's lead. Certainly, one can also provide choices. If a child doesn't make a choice, we don't necessarily just have to sit and wait for them to do that. Sometimes that might take a child with autism a long time. So we can certainly, provide choices, try to entice them into activities, that kind of thing, make it look really fun and exciting, like, oh, wow, look at my block tower. See if they get interested and then start, working with them. And then, like we've talked about, kind of sharing that control of the materials and kind of taking those balanced turns. Like in this picture here on the slide, if the child hands the ball to the therapist, well, now the therapist will have the ball, she'll have a turn, and the child will have to engage in some kind of communication to receive it back, that type of thing. In terms of, developmental strategies that we can then embed with these teaching trials, so, there's a lot that we automatically do when we're interacting with young kids, that's just sort of instinctive, but those kinds of, behaviors, like how you modulate your affect, for example, can be used more intentionally. So, in this particular picture, like it really looks like the mom or the adult is doing something pretty intentional to try to see what the child's response is. And, so we can really use these types of strategies in all sorts of ways. So things like the sound of your voice, your body language, your facial expressions. And one of the things that I think is really important about, kind of how we use affect, and this is really central to some of the NDBI interventions, like Jasper, for example, focuses on this quite a bit, is it's not necessarily just about the use of heightened affect to create engagement. Like I think we oftentimes think in those terms, particularly because that works fairly well for typically developing kids. Like the sillier you are, the more animated you are, the louder you are, the more a child responds to you oftentimes. But we also all know that that can go too far, right? And kids can get overwhelmed and they don't know when to stop and things get out of control. And with kids with autism, that may be a much more unpredictable or sensitive, kind of point. And for some kids, affect, may be overwhelming by definition. And so oftentimes the use of affect, I think, in intervention is a lot more about matching to the child's current state. And maybe upregulating a little bit to see if they'll follow you, like if you're trying to kind of get them more engaged, but not so much that they're overwhelmed, or, the opposite would be downregulate a little bit if they're too out of control and you're trying to, get them to come down with you. Like if you've ever been in a classroom where the teacher whispered to get the kids to quiet down, like it works because they tune into that cue, right? So it's not always just about, high affect. It's about modulation of affect and matching to the child's state. And then effectively using that, animation and affect to, to create sort of the right learning environment. The other piece that comes in here is this last point is, to be really tuned into the child's communication and emotional cues, and to make consistent responses to those. Because oftentimes, kids with social communication deficits are not completely lacking in skills or emotional or social cues, but they might be infrequent, they might be very subtle or very muted or diminished. And so kind of if you're not paying attention, you might miss it kind of thing. And so, a well-trained therapist will know to watch for those cues in that child and to get to know that child's patterns, and then to respond to those cues in a way that gives the child the message, hey, when you give off that cue, I respond in this way because it means something to me. And that, form of reciprocity right there, again, builds the child's social communication abilities. Oh, I'm frozen here. Let's see. That's strange. Oh, okay. All right. There we go. Weird. Okay. Another strategy that I've mentioned is imitating the child. So a lot of times we think, especially in autism, about getting the child to imitate us. And that is absolutely a goal. But the developmental literature, there's quite a bit of knowledge base about what the impact of imitating the child is on the child's engagement and interest, and again, reciprocity. If we just expect them to imitate us and we never imitate them, we're not creating reciprocity. So imitating the child, without expecting them to imitate you back necessarily, can be a really good strategy for enhancing their, sort of engagement and attention. And very often they will imitate you back. In fact, there is a strategy in NDBI called reciprocal imitation training, where you repeatedly imitate the child, 5, 6, however many times, and then you introduce a novel action to see if they will imitate you. And they very often do. And so again, you create this back and forth and this reciprocity that's really appropriate and a really nice context for learning. So you can imitate the child's actions on objects, which is, as depicted here in the picture, gestures, body movements, vocalizations, verbalizations. This is a place where, a lot of times stereotyped behavior, stereotyped speech, that kind of thing. If you imitate that, a lot of times the child will cue into like, oh, what are you doing? Like, you're doing what I'm doing. Huh, that's funny. But they're paying attention to you now. So that's good, right? And then there's ways that this strategy can be sort of expanded. So for example, imitating the child while narrating. So now you're kind of combining a couple strategies, right? Maybe this dad might say like, pick up the phone the way his child did. And then he might say, oh, call mommy, and, provide some narration there. And another variation would be to imitate the child and then add a novel action, like I mentioned. So, do a couple things the child is doing and then do something different and see if they notice you, that kind of thing. So let's look at a few video examples here. So I'm going to exit my PowerPoint here for a minute and go into a web browser, which you guys should be able to see. And we are going to start here. So this example, this is actually like a sort of pre-made teaching video. So it's like professionally done, but it describes incidental teaching, which is one, version of NDBI. And what I like about this example is it really, we're going to watch maybe about a minute of it. It really kind of highlights some of the main points that we've been talking about while sort of showing a few examples of that.
Welcome to the Autism Intervention Training video series. In this video, we will review 4 basic steps used in incidental teaching. Incidental teaching is a method of instruction that makes use of opportunities that arise in a child's daily life to create a teaching moment. However, we don't just wait for those opportunities to happen. Successful incidental teaching requires careful pre-planning and structuring of the environment. There are 4 main steps in incidental teaching. create an engaging setting, wait for the child to initiate, prompt the child for a fuller request, provide the desired outcome. The first step is to create an engaging setting which will tempt the child into initiating an interaction. For example, you might place favorite toys out of reach on high shelves or in transparent containers that the child cannot open. You might give only small portions of a favorite snack or engage in sabotage, such as taking the batteries out of a toy or unplugging the TV so that the child cannot operate them without your help. During daily self-care activities, such as dressing or brushing teeth.
Okay, so obviously the video goes on for quite a bit longer, but you know, what I like about this first minute or so is it just very nicely and clearly kind of lays out the steps in incidental teaching, and you can see from the environment, you know, how many materials they have available, you know, how likely it is that most kids would find at least one or two things in that setting, hopefully, that might be interesting to them. And then you start to see what some of the strategies are that they use to embed some of that teaching. You know, keep the lid on the bin, for example, until the child communicates, that kind of thing. And it all occurs in a very sort of, you know, naturalistic and free-flowing fashion. The next example, so I'm going to close this one and go to this one. So this one, interestingly, is titled Incidental Teaching. And it certainly is incidental teaching because, again, there's so much overlap between all of these types of intervention. But this could be, I would say, about maybe 5 out of 6 of the interventions that I have listed as being NDBI. So this example could absolutely be an example of pivotal response treatment. It could absolutely be an example of project impact, a parent working with a child. And what's really clear about this example is the way this activity is arranged. And so that the reason I picked it is for that. You know, this child could be sitting at the table, you know, having free access to the dot art markers, picking and choosing which ones she wants, having a nice time. But it would be a fairly solitary activity. And instead, what you can see is that the markers are right there where she can see them, but just out of her reach. And so an adult is really needed in order to facilitate this activity for her. And so along the way, the opportunities for social communication are really enhanced. So let's see how this looks.
Nice job closing it. What color do you want? We have red, green, orange, or purple. Orange. Orange? Here you go. Good job. Whoa, you dropped it. That's okay. One. Here you go, Amanda. What do you want me to do? Do you want me to close it? Close it, okay. What color? Red, green, blue, purple, or orange? Blue. Blue. Good job. Are you going to open it?
Okay. So again, short clip, but you get the idea. And again, you know, what I like about this is it doesn't, I mean, very clearly she's working on communication. Very clearly they're practicing their colors, but it's all embedded within an activity that she's otherwise enjoying, where she's getting reinforced for her communication, you know, by getting access to the activity, but it appears very natural. Sitting at a table with a child, doing an art activity would be a very natural, you know, parent-child or adult-child interaction. So this last example is an Early Start Denver model example, and this clinician is Sally Rogers, who is one of the developers of the model. And this looks different, although it contains a lot of the same elements. So what I really like about this particular example is this child is less verbal, and this interaction is more about the reciprocity and the back and forth and the engagement. And you really see how she's using the activity to gain his engagement. So she'll pause, for example, until he orients to her, and then she'll reinforce that by responding and rolling the ball back to him. And so this looks incredibly natural. This, if you didn't know what to look for, what features to look for, you might not, deem this therapy. You might deem this a play between an adult and a child, and it is play between an adult and a child, but she's being very intentional with what she's doing in order to maintain his engagement.
Logan's got balls. Ball. Ready for ball? Here it comes. Whee! Ball. Ball. Whee! Good job, Logan. Here comes ball. Ball. Oh, ball. 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 There you go. Ball. Whee! Ball. 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 Whee! Good job. Ball. 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 Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Ball. Whee! Good catch. Here comes ball. Whee! Throw.
Okay, so you can see in this example how there are times where she really kind of gets more down to his level to see if she can engage him more with like her facial expression or her affect. But there's also times where she's really pausing and waiting for him to orient back to her before she's going to make a response. And she creates this really nice routine where he can come to understand the responses that are expected, and she can reinforce those responses by praising him and continuing with the routine, and so on and so forth. So it's, again, it looks very natural, but there's some very specific things happening in that routine. All right, we are going to shift back to the PowerPoint. There we go. Okay. So, a lot of differences between these, these video examples, but also a lot of similarities. We see that contingency being embedded where the child needs to make a response before the adult is going to respond back to them. We see some really specific behaviors that the adults are looking for being targeted. We see, those teaching interactions occurring within a affectively engaging, set of circumstances, but also within a set of activities or with materials that the child is interested in. So let's look at some teaching examples, some actual kind of, hey, here's how you might use X, Y, or Z strategy to teach X, Y, or Z skill. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a series of kind of shared control type strategies, and which will basically demonstrate ways in which teaching trials can be embedded into natural interactions. So again, to kind of, refresh everyone's memory, the idea of controlling access or sharing control is to have that, situation with the child where maybe they've selected the activity, but where the adult has some control over how it's being implemented. So very simple examples of this. This is just like in its basic form, very simple examples of this are some of the things, some of the examples I have listed here. So if a child is nonverbal, for example, maybe you hold up their toy and you just wait. And if they look at you, or if they point to it, or if they reach for it, if those are appropriate target behaviors for that child, you provide the toy as reinforcement. If a child is developing some language, maybe you're doing a puzzle and the child has the puzzle board, but you have the pieces, and the child, you hold up a piece and the child needs to make a request, a single word request for that piece. As kids get more complex language, those kinds of interactions, verbal interactions can become more reciprocal. So, it might be offering a choice and then expecting the child to say something natural and more complex, like, hey, let's play barnyard, or, oh, I'd like to play the trains, to make a response before you move forward with playing with that particular toy. In incidental teaching, this is where the sort of phrase insight out of reach was coined, and I would say this is a strategy that's used throughout NDBI. The idea with insight out of reach is that the environment is arranged in such a way that the child knows what's available, understands what the choices are, and what they have access to, but can't necessarily access it independently. So in that incidental teaching video, you'll notice how organized all those shelves were and how things were in bins that the child had to take out but couldn't immediately have access to. Or in the example with the dot art, the activity was set up that way, which we'll talk about more in a minute. But there's lots and lots of strategies, and especially these are great strategies for families. Like just it's not to say that your living room or your child's bedroom needs to look like that video. That's, like I have 2 kids. That's not how most households look. But there's easy little changes and modifications or tweaks that you can make so that the child doesn't just have access to everything they want all the time. So, if they know how to operate the remote, which many very young kids do, place the remote up in a place where they can't get it, and now they have to communicate with you for it. That's an easy, store the remote on a shelf instead of on the arm of the couch. Easy little change, right? Or take a few of their highly preferred toys and store them in some of those bins like we saw in that video. Again, it doesn't mean your whole house has to be pristinely organized, but take the top 3 favorite toys, put them in bins that have lids that latch on, and store them that way so that the child has to communicate with you to get access. I oftentimes tell parents, store your cell phone or the iPad, up on a shelf somewhere, or password it so they have to communicate with you. And if you just, do a few of these kinds of things, you suddenly realize how many one-off opportunities for having to communicate with another person you can create by just doing, some small kind of modifications. The examples I gave were, just now are kind of outlined here in the table, and then obviously you request the child to communicate with you based on their skill level. Insight out of reach within an activity is like the example we saw with the dot markers. So oftentimes this works best with an activity where you might be kind of sitting down more, but setting up art activities, Play-Doh, even things like Legos or blocks or, toys that have a lot of pieces, you can kind of set them up in such a way that those materials can be seen but not accessed. So like at our program at Children's, when we do group activities, it's usually either like art or maybe a sensory activity like Play-Doh, and we'll give each child a tray to do their activity on, and we might give them one Play-Doh tool or one marker to begin with, and one sheet of paper or one small thing of Play-Doh. And then whatever adult is leading the activity is going to have a lot more materials in their possession that the kids can all see. And then they're going to, in order to get additional materials to continue their activity, they're going to have to be communicating with that adult. Or maybe communicating with a peer, for example, if someone else has the Play-Doh tool that you want, that kind of thing. And the shared control comes where they don't get access to those objects until they've communicated. This is a big one also for adults, for parents at home. This is another one where you hardly have to make a change to implement this all day long. Parents of young kids, I don't have to tell you, it occurs over and over and over and over again throughout your day that you have to assist your child, or that you just do, because that's just sort of the parental thing to do, right? It's natural with young kids that we assist them all the time with all sorts of things. And as they get older and more independent, we pull that back. So, putting on your shoes, zipping your jacket, getting access to a snack, reaching something you can't reach, over and over and over and over and over again. And as a parent, it's very natural to jump in and do that, right? You know what your child wants, and so you're like, oh, here, let me help you, honey. Or they're about to I don't know, get hurt. And so you're like, oh, wait, hang on, let me help you get down. Or, you know, it's instinctive as a parent. And, you know, in those moments, many of those, not if they're going to get hurt, you should intervene on that one. But, you know, many of those moments are opportunities where you could stop, because the child also anticipates your involvement much of the time. And you could stop in that moment and see if the child would initiate with you. Like, you know, they're struggling with the zipper of their jacket, or they need to put on their jacket because they're motivated to go outside. And if you wait and you don't jump in and help them, maybe they would orient to you, or maybe they would say something to you. And so you can create an opportunity in that context. Even just serving the child a snack or a meal, like get it all ready, walk over to the table, wait, see if they'll, again, look up, communicate with you, tell you what they want. And so, you know, you can see all three of these examples here on the screen are just waiting during typical family routines. A really good one is the one I have listed under the complex language, waiting when the child is struggling and you know they need help. Because again, you know when they need help. You're like, oh, this is going to be frustrating. And sometimes, again, you can miss the mark on that, because if it is too frustrating and then they melt down, then you've missed the opportunity. But sometimes if you wait a minute, or kind of say like, oh, do you need help? Or, oh, is it going okay? You can get them to, you know, to make a request from you, or to orient to you in terms of the need for help. This one I love because it's essentially what it is like milking the opportunity for, you know, for more than one piece of communication or more than one interaction. So provide a few pieces at a time so that you can evoke multiple communication trials within a given context. So this works best with, you know, anything that has multiple pieces or like sets of items. So for example, don't give the child all the snack you know they want. Give them 5 goldfish. Again, in our program at Children's, we usually, every child has a bowl or a plate, and, you know, we could just hand them the whole bag of goldfish or the whole sandwich, but we usually hand them a small portion of it, and then we're like, let us know when you want more. And suddenly during snack time, we can, you know, have multiple opportunities for interaction. Things like Mr. Potato Head, you know, where you can give the child the Mr. Potato Head but keep the pieces, or puzzle, give the child the puzzle board, keep the pieces. Give the child, you know, a few blocks, keep the rest. Start building the train track, don't give all the tracks, or give the tracks but don't give the cars. All these kinds of situations where, again, you can go back and forth, like, oh, you need more tracks, okay, here you go, you know, once they communicate with you. And then like, oh, what do you need now, some more, or do you want cars? And keep adding to the activity, but only as the child communicates with you. So this is a nice way to just get a lot more practice out of one, you know, activity. Intentional ignoring is sort of what I described about the gaining attention, you know, how we teach gaining attention when I gave that example a little bit back. So kind of ignoring the child on purpose, you know, either when they need help, like I just mentioned, or if you have something they want and you want them to appropriately gain your attention, you like, you know, it just kind of act busy, like, oh, huh, what? Oh, did you need something? And, you know, you can, once the child communicates, again, you turn, you give attention, you, like in the first example, you know, ignoring the child when you know they need more to drink, turning and giving attention when they make a social bid, and reinforce socially, but also by giving the drink. You know, there's, again, a lot of ways you can get kids to make responses. This is also a really good way to work on initiation, you know, where the child, they certainly have to be taught the behavior initially, but once they know the behavior, then, you know, you're putting them in a situation where they have to practice initiating with you. You're not necessarily saying to them, like, what do you need? Which is, you know, somewhat of a prompt. So this is a good way to target that. Sabotage sounds a little meaner than it is. It's not meant to be, you know, it's just meant to be another way to create opportunities. But, you know, again, sort of providing parts of an activity while withholding obvious necessary parts. And this can oftentimes be good, especially for kids who are maybe a little more socially tuned in or a little higher functioning, because it can become funny. You know, if they get it, it can become silly. Like, oh, here's your cereal, and then you don't give the spoon, and the kid is like, Mom, I need my spoon, hello. And if they understand the humor, then, you know, you can connect around that as well. Or, you know, again, providing train tracks with no trains, or giving like, oh, here's all the pieces to the Sorry game. What else do we need? Oh, we need a board. We can't play Sorry without the game board. So if you can make it into, you know, silly routines, then kids are oftentimes motivated, and a lot more goes into it than just the request. There's shared enjoyment, there's shared affect, there's a lot of richness into some of these kinds of activities. So I think we're going to be perfectly timed for about 15 minutes of questions, but a couple quick points I'll make before we do go to questions. So now might be a good time, if you haven't submitted a question, to, you know, go ahead and start doing that, and then we'll hear some of them. But, you know, to kind of summarize, I mean, a way that I like to think of NDBI, or kind of this naturalistic form of ABA, is I think of it similar to how we think about special education in terms of the least restrictive environment. You know, the more therapeutic something is, the more controlled it is, the more adult-driven it is, the more restrictive it is. You know, the more that we're stripping it away of its other properties or its other characteristics that might be valuable. So, for example, things like, you know, if we're in a very pared back setting and we don't have access to a range of materials, we might be missing the value that adds. So, you know, in our program, and sort of my approach to intervention is to start as naturalistic as possible, and, you know, to think of that as least restrictive, and then to move to more restrictive, so to speak, forms of intervention, or to use discrete trials and other tools to teach if I need to, and then to flex back to naturalistic because that's what mimics the natural environment. So I find that to be a helpful framework for sort of being able to utilize all the tools in the ABA and autism intervention toolbox, but to flex between or among them in a way that's appropriate for each individual child. NDBIs are also, you know, I would say more developmentally sort of friendly or appropriate for young kids. They don't focus on just sitting in a chair and doing intensive, you know, therapy. And then to focus on generalization and maintenance. So one thing I will say for any clinicians who are listening in, you know, NDBI can be harder for clinicians. I mean, you're flying by the seat of your pants, you're thinking on your feet, you're like, oh, what skill am I going to target while I'm playing with this toy that the child just selected? But once you get used to that flow, once you've practiced it and you sort of have a repertoire of ways that you teach skills with different toys, you can absolutely still maintain, you know, high treatment fidelity, good data collection, all those kinds of things. It's a little messier, and sometimes you miss a trial, or but it absolutely can be done. It just takes more practice. And then most importantly, it's fun. I mean, I like to tell clinicians, like, get creative, like get silly, think about all the ways they can be fun, and, you know, have fun with kids, and engage them, and then, you know, insert those trials for things that, you know, that child needs to work on. So a few resources, like I mentioned at the beginning, there are some published available manuals. There is the Early Start Denver model manuals, and the one on the left is more of a clinician manual. It includes a lot of research and, you know, sort of a lot more technical description, a lot of great information, but you know, maybe a little harder to access if you need an easy read, you know, something that's a little more just going to be intuitive. The one on the right, the Early Start for Your Child with Autism, is written for parents, and it doesn't focus so much on all the principles as it does, you know, just how to do it. Here's like a bunch of great ideas for ways that you can engage your child and teach them different skills using these activities. So that's a real favorite of mine for parents. Pivotal Response Treatment does have multiple books. I have the PRT Pocket Guide here because it's one of the newer ones, although a new Pivotal Response Treatment book did come out in 2019. So that's the newest book is not listed here. And then Project Impact, or Improving Parents as Communication Partners, is another one that I really like. It's very well laid out. The two-part, you know, combo there is a clinician book and then a parent book. And so, like, for clinicians that might be listening in, this is laid out session by session and is a very, very, you know, nicely kind of designed and easy to implement set of strategies for parent training. So I often recommend this to clinicians who want to do a, sort of a more formalized parent training program. So I think I might kind of gloss over this because it's just some of the, kind of the higher level thoughts about, where the field needs to go. I mean, we certainly need more research into the various treatment components, what works well for which types of kids, and so on. We need more widely disseminated training, which is why we, wrote this book that came out last year. We need increased access to care, but that's true for all types of autism intervention. But I think now would be a good time. There's a little plug for the book if you're interested in checking that out. But now would be a good time for us to open it up for some questions. So I think our moderator on Facebook Live was going to read us out some questions. Are we ready for that, Stacy?
Hi, we are ready for that, and we have not received any questions yet. So if anyone has any, we would love to see those. Submit in the comments here on Facebook, and we're happy to answer those.
All right. Well, maybe while you're waiting for those, Stacy, I'll go back to the previous slide and just mention these are two other really good resources, not specific to NDBIs per se, but these are two organizations that periodically conduct very thorough reviews of the research in the area of autism intervention. And so, especially I think for parents and also for providers, though, these can be useful resources to kind of understand what is the empirical basis or the research support behind an intervention that you might be trying. And it's not just specific to behavioral interventions. They review a wide range of autism interventions. And so that can be a helpful way to know, hey, is a thing I'm doing have good research support, or is it maybe a little more emerging and it's not very well supported? So I like to just point out those resources. But now we can go back to any possible questions. I hope that we're not lacking in questions because no one's listening or everyone already logged off.
We have a great question from Natalie. What is the best way to include family and friends when the child has challenging behaviors when out around others and different environments that is not their home?
Okay, this is a very good question. A lot of layers in that question. So how to include family and friends when the child has challenging behaviors and you're not in your home environment. I think that's a fair summary of that question. So, I mean, I guess one of the things I always think about in these kinds of situations is there's a balance there, right? I mean, there is a balance around just kind of advocating for your child with autism and making sure that other people that they might be interacting with sort of know what some of the parameters are for things that make the child comfortable or not comfortable. That's a very different issue than like the how do you actually support them with intervention strategies. But I do think that's a big part of that scenario is how do you help the family members understand the child's comfort and so on, so that behaviors don't get triggered. But from an intervention perspective, one of the biggest, things that I think is really helpful in a context like that is in ABA, we call it antecedent interventions. And it's a fancy way of saying, what can you do to prevent the behavior? What can you do to make that situation as easy and appealing and motivating or engaging for the child as possible so that they will be successful, because you know that there will be parts of that situation that are challenging for the child. So an example of an antecedent intervention that I might use in a situation like that might be, okay, we're going to grandma's house. We're not going to just show up at grandma's house and rely on grandma's snacks and grandma's toys, or maybe lack of toys, and, hope that we're going to just be able to keep ourselves busy. We're going to bring with us our arsenal of things that we know keep my child happy. We're going to bring all my child's favorite snacks, maybe even treats that my child doesn't get access to normally. We're going to bring preferred toys, preferred activities, maybe especially if you're trying to have some family interaction, maybe especially toys or activities that promote a bit of interaction. iPad might keep the child busy, but totally isolated. The child's favorite toy where grandma could get down on the floor and be like, oh, maybe I can build, do a little bit of trains with you, or, where you might be able to kind of facilitate a little bit, like, oh, here, Grandma, you hold the train track, and when he looks at you, you can give it to him. That kind of thing, where you're kind of maybe embedding a little bit of NDBI strategies, but like prompting the family member through it in a way that will be successful for the child. So I think the key to situations like that is to think about all the aspects of intervention that are focused on motivation, engagement, child choice, child-driven activities, and to try to think, how can you bring that with you into that situation and prevent behavior? Because once behavior happens, you're pretty much in the mode of like reaction, right? And a lot of times outside of home, reaction becomes, we got to go, like we're bailing. And so if we can prevent behavior, we're oftentimes more effective in, actually being able to be in that context successfully. So hopefully a few of those suggestions might be helpful.
All right, so moving on to the next question from Bobby. Bobby is wondering, what can you do if you cannot get a child's eye contact or they do not seem motivated to work with you at all?
This is challenging. I mean, I would separate out those two behaviors, actually. Eye contact, I would separate from lack of motivation to engage with you at all. If you can't get a child's eye contact, what I might oftentimes do is try to figure out, is there any social communication or orienting or engagement behavior that you can get? I mean, sometimes eye contact is not the end all be all of social, behaviors. And sometimes it's a lot harder for kids than we really realize. It's very interesting to talk to adults with autism about eye contact. And the variability in how aversive people find it is wide. Some people will tell you like, oh yeah, it wasn't that big of a deal. Other people will tell you, having to look at you is physically painful for me. And there's no real way to know that in a young child, right? Like, so there's no real way to gauge how hard is that skill for that child. So I think in that case, I might look for any behavior that the child engages in that shows some kind of, communication, even if it's as simple as like leaning forward because they're, as a gesture or as body language, or certainly reaching for something would be more clear. But oftentimes, like when we're teaching in our program at Children's, we don't necessarily target eye contact right away. Instead, we target other behaviors that are more concrete and kind of easier to train or teach, like reaching. Especially because we can prompt you to reach. We can't like force you to look, just the same way as we can't force you to talk. We can prompt you to reach and get a pretty successful response and then reinforce it and then create a cycle there where the child is starting to feel successful. And so if we can scaffold up from whatever they might be doing and reinforce it and then create that momentum, a lot of times, you might find that the eye contact starts to come a little bit. And if it doesn't, that's also certainly information for you about how challenging it might be to teach eye contact. Now, lack of motivation, that's a different question, right? Because eye contact isn't the only behavior associated with motivation. And there are those kids who are super hard to motivate. They have no toy interest. They have very little interest in other people. But they do typically have interest in something. Now, it might seem really mundane, really hard to engage around, et cetera. But most kids, here or there is a kid like this, but most kids don't just like sit in one place and do nothing all day, right? They wander around, they engage in stereotyped behavior, they engage in gross motor play. And if you can find anything that you can join them in and start to build from it, that sort of starts to become the entry point. So in Early Start Denver model, there's a strategy called sensory social routines. And the idea behind sensory social routines, they're the kinds of routines that we kind of instinctively do with very young kids, where you might like, tickle the child and then pause and wait for them to orient to you. Or you might like pick the child up and spin them around and set them down and then wait for them to orient before you do it again. And a lot of times those kids who are very hard to motivate, you can engage them in some sort of repetition of a routine like that. And if you do the routine several times without, expecting a response, like spin you around, set you down, pause, but don't expect a response, but then spin you around again, set you down, pause, don't expect a response. Do it a third time, because now hopefully the child might see, oh, I see how this works. Pause, see if you can get any kind of body language, again, orienting in any way, et cetera. And then you start to kind of, build from there. But there are those kids, absolutely. And you sometimes, we sometimes have kids in our program who have two goals. It might be like reaching for preferred objects, like the few things we can get the child to reach for, and orienting during a sensory social routine. That might be the only two goals to begin with. And then we just scaffold up from there. It can be hard though. I know we're getting close to our time, Stacy, but are there any other questions coming in?
I think that is all for the questions for tonight. The one thing I do want to say is that the next Autism 200 series lecture will be on May 21st. It's going to be Autism 205, being an ally to your autistic teen and guiding them to be an ally to others. So this is going to be a